Hello, Sales Hacker community. Thanks for joining us today on another Sales Hacker webinar. My name is Scott Barker, and today we're diving into competitive deals. And specifically, we're going to run through 5 different selling strategies that are going to help you crush your opposition, which is what we're all looking to do. And if you're with us today, feel free to jump on the chat feature right now. Tell us your name, company, title, where you're from. We're going to keep this interactive. And before I introduce my awesome guest over here, and also a friend of mine, just a few housekeeping items. So this will be recorded, so you got to jump off, or you want to share it out with a friend, it's all good. We'll send this over in an email once we wrap up. Please ask questions throughout. Like I said, we want this to be as engaging as possible. It is for you, the community, so get involved. We'll field relevant questions throughout, and then we'll leave some time at the end for a little Q&A. And this particular webinar will be presentation style. So we've got some nice meaty content to get through with some awesome slides. But anyway, all that boring stuff out of the way. Today I'm joined by none other than the Chris Orlov. Chris, welcome to the community, man.
So happy to be here. I'm excited. This is, I don't know how many of these webinars I've done with Sales Hacker, but they never get old. So I'm looking forward here.
Love it, man. I'm definitely excited to pick your brain. You always make me seem smart in meetings because I get to steal all of your cool facts that you guys come up with over there at Gong and throw them out in meetings. It's awesome.
Hey, that's the data science team, man. They make me look smart. I'm just the guy with the pen, the scribe sitting on the treasure trove of data. So
there you go. I love it. Well, we all get to benefit from it. But anyway, so for those of you who perhaps haven't ever heard of this tool called LinkedIn and don't know who Chris is, you may be unfamiliar with him. Quick kind of introduction, add some more color. So Chris is the Senior Director of Product Marketing over at Gong, which is a conversation intelligence platform. Previously, you were actually the co-founder at Conversature.
Yeah, you nailed it. It's the worst name ever. I'm surprised you got it right. Most people do not get that right.
It's a bit of a mouthful, which was actually, funnily enough, a small competitor of Gong that joined forces back in November 2016.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Nice. And then previous to that, you were, very much in the sales mix. So you were the sales manager over at InsideSales.com, which is really cool. And we were talking before this. Fun fact: you were also once a wannabe rock star drummer who decided to get into tech because you were sick of being broke.
Yeah, I didn't want to live in a van down by the river. So I also just got tendonitis in pretty much every limb from practicing the drums for too long every day. So eventually just had to give up on that dream, and here I am.
There you go. Yeah, it's funny. And we were talking, I was actually once a budding drummer myself. My dad was a super talented drummer, so I grew up hearing him, bang away. But my rock star dreams died around like grade 8 or grade 9. So didn't stick with it long enough to get the tendonitis. But
nice.
Anyway, so today it's really all about, this shift really from, back in the day, it was all about what you sell was really the single most important thing. And we're seeing now that how you sell it can be equally or even more important than, what. So with that, I think, Chris, take it away, man.
Yeah, I think I'll just start by riffing off what you said, and I'll make a little bit of a claim. If you are relying on your product to differentiate your company to win competitive deals, you are going to be increasingly more vulnerable as time goes on. So the competitive battleground has actually shifted from product differentiation to what actually happens during sales conversations. In other words, the new competitive battleground is what your salespeople, or what you, if you're a professional salesperson, say, do, and write throughout the sales process. That is where the perception of difference is really created, rather than having a product that's incrementally better or different from your competition. And the reason I can make this claim with any validity And the reason this is happening is because the world is exploding in competition, especially B2B, which I'm assuming makes up the majority of everybody listening to this. Every B2B category is absolutely exploding with competitors and choices and alternatives. And I'll give you just one example to make this very concrete. Let's take marketing technology. This is the marketing technology landscape from 7 years ago, August 2011. And it already looks fairly overwhelming. It's already a lot to sort through. Telling the differences between all of these is already very difficult. There are 150 of them on here. But keep in mind, this is 7 years ago. Today, it looks like this. It's gotten way worse. It's overwhelming. There are over 5,000 vendors in the quote-unquote MarTech landscape. And I don't use this as a way to just speak to those selling MarTech. I use this as an illustration to make that point, the point that every B2B category is absolutely being proliferated with choices and competition. And your differentiated product, superior as it might be, is very unlikely to cut through this clutter and make an impression on your customers.
Totally. Chris, do you think we'll see the same thing, sorry to cut you off, same thing with sales tech in the next few years?
I think it's already happened with sales tech, and I think it's already happening with just about every B2B category that's happening out there. MarTech is the most extreme example. You know, not all of it's at the extent that MarTech is, where there's 5,000 or 6,000 vendors, but the majority of businesses that rely on differentiation as a competitive strategy are seeing this. There are some types of businesses that don't rely on differentiation as a competitive strategy. Some businesses rely on cost leadership, but I'm not talking to those businesses. You know, we're talking about like Walmart and Amazon, who can charge very low prices but still have insane profits because they make up their low margins through volume. They differentiate through cost leadership. But if you're a business who relies on differentiation as your core competitive strategy rather than cost leadership, then competition is exploding, and differentiation needs to shift from product differentiation to what you do during your sales conversations. And by the way, this like explosion of competition that I just illustrated is not likely to get any better for you. It's likely to get more difficult. And the reason is the economy is becoming more global. So instead of you just dealing with domestic competitors, and I would guess that the majority of this audience is in North America, you're seeing startups and other companies start to enter into the US market to get their unfair share of the market. And so it's going to become even more of a tight pitch. In fact, here's some, you don't even have to look at this or know the exact numbers. This is just an illustration of global trade over the last couple centuries or last century or so. And you can see that it has skyrocketed just in the last 10 or 20 years. There are tons of foreign competitors from innovative places like Israel or Western Europe and all kinds of places all over the world that want your customers. So there's actually one more trend. We've talked about two trends that have two trends that have made the world more competitive. And the last thing I'll touch on that really should put the nail in the coffin as to why you can't rely on your product to differentiate is this rise in what we call comparison searches on Google. So that's when a customer has maybe evaluated your product and they go, I wonder what alternatives there are. I've evaluated a couple products. Now I want to compare them side by side. This type of search volume has gone up over the last few years. So we've already talked about how there's so much clutter and choices for customers, and it's growing. To make it even worse, these customers are actively putting themselves in the midst of this clutter by searching for these alternatives. And it is likely to put them in a state where they cannot tell one product from another. In fact, that leads me to my next point. This is why you cannot rely on your product for differentiation. Differentiating your product is important, but it's only a ticket to play the game. And here's what happens when you rely on your product to differentiate. You live, breathe, and sleep with your product. You know it inside and out, and you probably know your competitors' products inside and out. But you're like the parent who can easily tell the difference between their two children. And that's because they're around their two children all the time. They can, it's super easy for them, but it is not easy at all for everybody else because they're not so immersed in that world. And it's
Right.
the same thing with your product. You probably know you have superior product, and it probably is legitimately different than your competitors. But when your buyers look at your product and then your competitor's product and then maybe one more competitor's product, they can't tell the difference.
Right.
So that leads me back to this original insight, and we're going to get to some specific tips, tactics, and strategies that you can use to transform your sales conversations. But I just want to make one more point. Sales conversations are the new vehicle for differentiation. They are where the perception of difference is created, whether your product is highly differentiated or a commodity. How you approach your sales conversations is what will separate you or make you look very close to what your competitors do. So when you do lead with your product to differentiate, here's a quick narrative of how it typically plays out. Even if you're benefit focused, not feature focused, even if you're benefit focused, this still plays out. You start selling to your buyer, and then your competitor enters the deal, and you start one-upping each other in terms of either product benefit or product features. And at some point, the customer says, you know what, let's create this comparison spreadsheet. Let's list our vendors on here and all of the features and put check marks and X's so that we can make an intelligent business decision. And what happens is you end up one-upping your competitor on one feature, and then they match you and they one-up you on another feature, and that cycle continues. I call this the spec war. You one-up them, they match you, they one-up you, and you retaliate. And what that leads to is the buyer says, you know what, these products are more or less the same thing. They're pretty much on par. Some of them have incrementally better features in this area, but the other one is a little bit better in this area. So because they're more or less the same, they start grinding you both down on price. They start asking for differences because they start asking for discounts because the differences are not meaningful enough for them to want to pay a premium. And the quote unquote winner in this situation, if that's what you can call it, is the person or the company that dropped their pants, frankly. I don't mean to sound like crass or anything, but the ones that give away the farm by discounting the most.
Yeah, and this is not what you want as a sales professional, because that
it's horrible.
Is now 60% off your commission, your quota, everything. Yeah. So
this is kind of like the nail in the coffin for how this story typically ends. Even if, whether you lose the deal or win the deal. I was actually talking to a VP of sales friend of mine the other day, and I asked him if I could quote him, but he would not let me put his face on it because obviously he doesn't want his product to seem like it's a commodity.
Right.
But in his mind, his product is far superior to his competitors, very differentiated. But he asked the customer why they bought. And they said, well, the products were more or less the same. In fact, I have never seen two products look more identical before. So I bet you guys because it came down to price. You guys offered the best price. And he was just flabbergasted by that. Like internally, they eat their own dog food, they drink their own Kool-Aid about how much better their product is, but they've been unable to communicate that effectively to the market. And it's because there's so much choice and alternatives and options in each category. So the goal here is to change this narrative. Get out of the spec war and the price battle or the pricing war and start separating yourself from your competition, not just with what you sell, but with how you sell. Approach the conversations in a totally different way, and your buyer will basically disqualify your competitor at the beginning of the sales cycle if you can play your cards right. So we'll get into some of the data here. Most of the strategies and principles that we're going to cover in this webinar, not all of them, but most of them come from us analyzing a large pool of sales conversations and B2B deals. So these are sales conversations that were recorded on platforms like Zoom and GoToMeeting. They were transcribed from speech to text, and they were analyzed with deep learning algorithms to understand what selling behaviors in response to competitive deals lead to the best outcomes. Won deals instead of losing them to the competitors and avoiding this pricing war. So let's get into some of these. So the first principle is that, and this is more of a principle than a strategy. This is like something you need to internalize. The skill is not in understanding the strategy. The skill is understanding which strategies apply to which situations. That's what's really going to separate the super successful sellers from people that are maybe winning deals, but the only way they're doing it is by one-upping their competitors in a spec war or cutting their prices the most. And here's why we can make this claim. Here's why you need to know different strategies for different situations. Competitive dynamics or competitive deals behave very differently in different situations. And the two situations I'm going to illustrate are, what do you do during mature market competitive conversations, meaning your category has been around for maybe 10 years and there's fierce competition, versus should you approach competitive deals differently in a new market where there's still low category awareness. You have competitors, but not very many of them, but maybe they're very strong competitors. They're kind of helping you champion the category. And what we found, and these are, this graph, what we're looking at here is a measure of competitor conversations throughout the sales cycle in mature markets. And what we see here is at the beginning of the sales cycle, up where we start the graph, buyers come into the sales cycle guns a-blazing. They're discussing competitors already. They're talking about what makes you different already, immediately. You're like just thrown into cold water immediately when the sales cycle starts.
First question out of the mouth. What's different from you and your competitors? Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, you're already kind of like pushed against the wall and you're on the defensive. And you can see there's a little bit of a competitive radio silence in the middle. It's brought up again toward the end. You're not really talking about competition anymore. It looks totally different, though, in a new market. So let's just contrast mature market, new market. New market, you're really not talking about competition as much. In fact, throughout most of the sales cycle, you're not talking about competition as much. And part of that is because it's a new category and there's not much competition to talk about. But at the end of the sales cycle is when competitive discussions really start to heat up. So what works for you if you're in a new market or a new category is going to be different than what works for you as a selling strategy than if you're in a mature category. So I don't have a specific selling strategy for you yet. We're going to get into that. But the first principle to understand is you need to understand which strategies are going to apply to which situations. Which ones work in new markets versus mature markets. When selling against low price competitors versus selling against premium price competitors. There is not going to be a silver bullet to just totally disarm your competition. You have to be a little more dynamic than that, if that makes sense.
Makes total sense.
All right, so here's principle number 2, win early. So what we found is that when competition comes into your deal, it's actually a good thing. You are more likely to win that deal with your competitor involved in the deal than if competition was totally absent from your deal and it was a quote unquote blue ocean or a green field. You have no competition. But there's a caveat to that. You have to win the competitive battle early, meaning there is a correlation with a higher win rate if you're having competitor discussions early in the conversation, and there is a highly negative correlation between win rates and winning the deal if you don't start talking about your competition until late in the game. And the takeaway there is you need to get into the sales cycle and cement the buying criteria in your favor early on. If you remember nothing else from this presentation, remember this one sentence. Competitive deals are good, but you have to win early. So there are many things you can do to win early. We're going to talk about a couple of those through the rest of the principles and strategies. But 2 things that come to mind are, number 1, creating a commercial educational pitch that educates the customer on a problem that they might not know you have, that only you can uniquely solve. That is a great way to shift the buying criteria in your favor. And a second way is just get the customer to ask your prospect questions, like plant questions for your customer to ask your competitor. Sorry, I kind of like just demolished that sentence. Let me start. Feed your customer some questions to ask your competitor that serve as landmines.
Right.
I can't give you specific examples because your product is going to be different, but go lock yourself in a room for an hour and just brainstorm some of these questions. What questions would you want your customer asking your prospects? And when they say, hey, I think we're going to take a look at X competitor, say, great, ask this one question to them or ask these two questions. Those are some of the great ways to win early. I think the bigger one, though, is creating this pitch where you're educating the customer about a problem that they either undervalue or maybe don't know that they have that only you can uniquely solve. And that's a very tough skill. We'll talk about some examples toward the end of this, but the takeaway is to win early. And I like to use this analogy. What you do early in the sales cycle has a lot more power than what you do late in the sales cycle. If you think of a meteor like barreling toward Earth, at the beginning of its trajectory, if you change that meteor's path by 1%, it's going to miss Earth by a country mile. But if it's already pierced the Earth's atmosphere and it's barreling toward, some continent, if you change the trajectory by 1%, it doesn't matter. It's still going to smack Earth. And the takeaway there is you can change it. The sales cycle is the same way. What you do early in the sales cycle, the buying criteria you set, questions you ask, and the types of insights you deliver to your customers early on, they're going to carry that with them throughout the sales cycle and view the competitor evaluation through that lens. Whereas if you're late in the game and they say, hey, we're actually going to move forward with your competitor, now you're pushing a boulder up the hill. It's kind of too late. Their preferences are already crystallized. Their buying criteria is already crystallized. You're very unlikely to change that. But at the beginning, they're a lot more impressionable, and that's your opportunity to set things in your favor.
Mm-hmm. Super, super interesting. And I love those kind of, bomb questions you can ask so that, implant them. I've had a lot of success with those for sure. And Chris, if you don't mind, we've got a question from our community here. And so this is Miranda, and it's kind of around like more rip and replace. So not like a net new deal that you're working on. And Miranda asks, what about if they are already partnered with a quote unquote subpar competitor in a mature market? So the last strategy in this, we're going to talk about how you should be crafting like your sales pitch, for lack of a better term, that differentiates you. And we kind of touched on it already. It's that you should create this commercial teaching pitch that teaches them about a problem that they don't know they have. I'll give you a little bit of a sneak peek into what we're going to talk about at the end here. That pitch should be a story about how the customer's status quo is no longer safe. There are external trends and threats that are being inflicted on them that is making the status quo no longer acceptable. The fact that they're using an entrenched competitor does not change that story at all, because the entrenched competitor is part of the status quo. So again, I'll give you an example of how this plays out at the end. But your narrative, your story that you should be telling is there are external threats. The world is changing. It's making your status quo unsafe. At one point, you purchased this competitor. And at that time in your life, it was a good decision. But to no fault of your own, things are changing. The world is getting more competitive. There's some sort of regulatory compliance shift that's happening that you can't control. And again, like we'll get into a more concrete example toward the end here, but the fact that they are using an entrenched competitor won't change your story once you know what story to tell. Awesome. Thanks for the question, Miranda. And she just said, beautiful. Thank you. I love it.
Yep.
Killing it, Chris.
All right. So I think this is the last. Not quite the last. The last piece of data before we'll move on to the next principle here is in this analysis we did of 1 million sales calls, the AI was able to understand the specific, actually I'm talking about the wrong data point. I'm just realizing that late in the sales cycle, this is about pricing discussions. So the AI that was able to identify or analyze these sales conversations could identify the specific topics that were being discussed. So next steps, pricing, and other topics that are specific to the companies that were analyzed. And we found that if you are talking about pricing late in the sales cycle and your competitors are still in that sales process, you're less likely to actually win the deal. In fact, I skipped over a graph without realizing it. This is a correlation between talking about pricing in the last stage of the sales cycle while the competition is still in the deal you're less likely to win. There's a negative correlation. And that just goes back to the point that you really need to win competitive deals early on. They are a good thing, but only if you win early.
Right. It kind of goes back to that, bidding war, whoever's going to, drop their pants the most if you're still talking about pricing and there's people in it.
Exactly. And the takeaway I would say for managers, like the sales managers or even sales executives that are listening to this, is make sure you're getting involved in competitive deals early on. So don't wait until, it's the habit of sales managers to not get involved in deals until they're like almost across the finish line. But the bottom line is the only impact you're going to have is if it's very head-to-head. What's more powerful is as soon as a deal becomes competitive, you get involved with that deal. So you don't even have to get on a call, just brainstorm with your rep. Hey, how are we going to change the trajectory of this deal in our favor while we still have the opportunity to do that? And a great way to make sure you're getting involved is just put different systems in place that act as these early warning signs to alert you when a deal becomes competitive. It could be a competitor mention alert in something like a conversation intelligence platform. And it could be something like the rep updates Salesforce or their CRM that the deal is competitive, and you get an email alert that says that. The bottom line is set up something that alerts you to when deals become competitive so you can get involved and ensure that deal wins and that you guys mold the buying criteria in your favor.
Love it.
All right, principle number 3, position or be positioned. That's one of my favorite marketing quotes of all time, and it's so applicable to sales. Positioning is not just a marketing term. So back to the analysis we talked about, we found out that successful reps who beat out their competition spend 58% more time on quote unquote positioning related topics at the beginning of the sales cycle than their less successful peers do. So some examples of positioning topics would be taking your prospect through like your call deck, your sales call deck that tells the story of how your category came to be and positions you as kind of like the expert in the field. Another example we use at G2 Crowd is before we even talk about our product, we pull up. I keep getting my words mixed up. Another example here at Gong, not G2 Crowd, is before we even.
That's why I didn't even jump in. we all got it.
Audience. Sorry for the audience. Another example we use at Gong is before we even talk about the product, we pull open our G2 Crowd page in the quadrant because we have this phenomenal presence on G2 Crowd. We have tons of product reviews and they're all really great. We have like 700 reviews and they're all like 4.5 and 5-star reviews. Mm-hmm. And so we bring that up at the beginning of our pitch because we're like off the charts and that image stays in the mind of the buyer. So the takeaway here is before you get into your product, position your company, put your stake, make your claim, make sure you're separating your company from your competition before you start separating your product from your competition. That will help prevent these kind of feature by feature comparison death matches that we all want to avoid.
Yeah, awesome. And I think that kind of actually just answered a question that we got from the audience here from Eric. It was, how much of an impact does company reviews, LinkedIn / Crunchbase and influencers, how much does that influence whether or not a company decides to buy from you? So
I would say huge with one caveat. If you are selling to very small businesses, it's going to have, I don't even want to say that. If you're not a mission critical app, if it's very easy to rip out and replace your product and there's really no consequences, if you're like the epitome of a nice to have, then that stuff is going to help you, but it's not going to be like the deciding factor because businesses don't feel like they're partnering with you. But when your product is a little bit bigger of a deal and your customers have to not only evaluate your product, but also your company, like does the company have staying power? Is this going to be a good company to partner with? Then that stuff is arguably more important than like a slightly better product.
Right.
I would, if your marketing team hasn't built that stuff out, I would complain to them until they do because it's one of the most effective sales tools that you can ask for.
Yeah, I would agree. And I'm going to pose a slightly difficult question to you, Chris. What if, so I know Gong, you guys don't have this problem. You guys have amazing reviews. everyone is 4.5, 5 stars. What if that wasn't the case? What if you had a competitor out there that had better reviews than you, and let's say you're a sales rep? How would you get around that?
So you need to change the conversation away from that stuff. And I don't know what the business looks like, but even if you fixed it, which you should, you should go get a bunch of product reviews. You still shouldn't make that the core of the conversation, because your competitors have great stuff. And now you're just, it's like, oh, we have great reviews, but so do our competitors. So now you've got to figure out a different wedge to use to differentiate yourself. Yeah. And most of that is going to come back to the narrative you tell, your commercial teaching pitch that you begin the sales cycle with, the story about the changing status quo and how it's being threatened and how your customer is no longer safe to no fault of your own. Oh, and by the way, our product is able to help eradicate this.
Yeah.
So you don't lead with your product, you lead to your product. And I'll show you one example of what these pitches look like at the end here. But before we move on to the next principle, I just want to, drive the nail into the coffin. I think that's like the third time I've said this phrase on this already. But this is one of my favorite.
Nails in the coffin, right?
Lots of nails in the coffin. I mean, we're selling against our competitors. We're going to have nails in the coffin. This is one of my favorite quotes from Jeffrey Moore, who wrote the book Crossing the Chasm. He says, buyer evaluations are often simply rationalizations of pre-established positioning. So a lot of big words in there. What that basically means is if you are able to implant your positioning in your buyer's mind early in the sales cycle, the rest of the sales cycle is basically them just checking boxes and going through the motions. They know they're going to decide on you, but they quote unquote have to look at your competitors because it's company policy. But you've already wedged yourself in their mind so deeply that there's very little that is going to change.
Totally agree. 100%.
All right. Principle number 4, cling to a single hot button. So I'm going to tell a quick story about our CEO, Amit Bendov. He used to be a salesperson, years ago. And I can't even remember what company it was with, but I remember he was selling enterprise software, and he was in a head-to-head competitive deal with his chief competitor. And it was just back and forth. And finally, the customer chose his competitor, and it devastated him because he was like relying on the commission, and he knew the rep that he was competing against. He knew the competitor rep, and he reached out to him and said, hey, I would love to buy you a beer to understand how you won that deal. Like, you already won it. I'm not going to take it away from you, obviously. Now, there's nothing I can do. I just want to know what you did to win. And so he took this sales rep out for a beer, and he asked him, like, how did he win the deal? And he said he found the one thing the buyer cared about that was unique to his product, the one feature that really differentiated him from Amit's company. And that's all he talked about when the competition came up. Anytime they talked about Amit's company, he reverted back to that one unique selling proposition. And he never talked about, he had other unique selling propositions that he could have played up, but he only stuck to the one most important and reverted to that anytime competitor discussions came out. Now, fast forward to today, and in the same analysis, we found that super successful salespeople do the same thing. They kind of play the field at the beginning to understand which hot button is going to resonate the most, and they'll try a few early in the sales cycle. But once they hone in on one of them, once they really understand what is their one unique advantage over the competition, they cling to that as tightly as they possibly can. Anytime the conversation turns back to the competition, they revert back to that one hot button. And the reason this works is I like to use the analogy of whiskey. I like to drink whiskey every now and then. And if you think about like a cup of whiskey, it is very strong. And if you pour water into it, it starts to dilute. Okay, messaging works the exact same way. If you stick with one thing, it's pure, it's strong, it stays in the brain. But as soon as you start making several arguments, even though they might be good arguments, you start to dilute your message. Now your buyer has to remember multiple things, and they start to like get through all this clutter, and they can't remember like what differentiates you. Versus if you just stick to one winning argument and you just repeat it and repeat it and repeat it, and you wedge it into the mind of your buyer, they're going to remember that while your competitor is scattering their efforts among many arguments, which all of them end up forgotten. So
I
in
love
your
that
deals,
analogy.
find the hot button and just stick to it like the deal depends on it, because it probably does.
I love it. Well, the question is then, Chris, do you put any drops of water in your whiskey?
If it's scotch, I do. I do put a couple drops of water in scotch. So just don't flood it. That's the takeaway here. Maybe it's not a perfect analogy. You just put me on the spot, but I'm sure everybody understood it.
I got it. I
All
love it.
right. So yeah, principle number 5, this might be my favorite one. Don't lead with your product, lead to your product. Even if it's product benefits and not features, lead with a changing environment that is threatening your buyer's status quo rather than differentiating with your product. And Zuora is a great example of this. If any of you have not read this article, I'd recommend going to do it. It's called like the greatest sales presentation I've ever seen. It's written by a guy named Andy Raskin. And he talks about how Quora does not talk about their product at the beginning of their sales pitch. They don't even talk about the product's benefits or the benefits of the subscription economy. They talk about how the world is changing. People are not buying products anymore. They're subscribing to products now. In fact, businesses that are not molding themselves to this new trend are going out of business. And they show a bunch of stats about businesses that are dying because people are subscribing to products instead of buying them. And they talk about this changing world that starts to threaten the customer's status quo. Again, no fault of their own, and forces them to take a look at a new way of thinking. After they've gone through this entire narrative, then they introduce the product, and suddenly a product benefit statement resonates. You start with a product benefit statement, it just sounds generic. But when you set the context of the world is changing, here are the trends, here's how it's threatening you, the status quo is no longer safe, here's what to do about it. By the way, our product can help you do that. That is a much more powerful message. And here's the last example I want to give you. This is one of my favorite examples. So imagine for a second that you are selling formaldehyde-free furniture retailers. Formaldehyde is a chemical that can cause cancer. And you are basically selling green furniture. So over here on the left, we're leading with benefits. We're leading with our product. We're trying to differentiate based on our product. We supply formaldehyde-free furniture for retails. It's healthier, greener, cleaner. Your customers will love it. You'll make more money. That's not that compelling. People might seem interested, but as soon as they get off the call, their enthusiasm's going to wane. There's nothing really driving urgency there. There is no loss aversion that was introduced into your message. Versus over here on the right, where you lead with a changing environment that's threatening their status quo and really forces them to wake up. And you start with American citizens are becoming more health conscious and wary of dangerous chemicals. In fact, if you look at Google's search volume for formaldehyde-free furniture, it's up 600% in 2 years. People are really concerned about this. By the way, we supply that. That's a very simplified version of the message, but if you're a retailer and you sell a bunch of furniture that has formaldehyde in it, and you hear this message where customers are no longer accepting that, and here's the proof, now you are much more receptive to our furniture is formaldehyde-free, it's clean, customers are going to love it. That works much better. And the final example I'll give you, and I'll just be totally transparent, if you want one more example of how to craft a story like this, not that I'm a shining example of this, once you get the recording of this webinar, go back to the first 10 minutes. I went through a bunch of trends that are changing the world. The world is becoming more competitive. It's going to continue to become more competitive. Buyers can't tell the difference between products even when they're differentiated. So your differentiation must come down to your sales conversations. I wouldn't say that's an amazing example, but I would say it's a pretty good example of how you should craft your story in a way that leads to your unique advantages and really threatens the buyer's status quo.
I love it. We got a meta webinar going on here. Webinar Inception.
So the last thing I'll end on before we get over to question and answers, when everything else looks the same, your sales conversations are what are going to separate you from your conversation. If you approach sales conversations with the examples I just covered, where you're talking about this changing status quo, you're tying the conversations back to your buyer's strategic initiatives, if your competitors are leading with the benefits of their product, which are generic, they're going to be disqualified early on. They're going to look like a commodity vendor, and you're going to look like a strategic partner, and you're going to be able to run circles around your vendors, or not around your vendors, around your competitors, if you can get your story right. So that's the end. I think we're good to, it sounded like we had a few questions trickle in throughout, but if there are any other questions, I'd love to field them.
Absolutely. So we have a ton. So this is awesome. Thank you everyone for the great engagement. Okay, so let's go. Okay, where's a good question? Okay, so we've got Miranda's got another question. So do you have any insight or data on successful messaging that best complements your findings in your study analyzing calls? I think safe to say we kind of wrap that up a little bit in the end there.
Yeah. So, and I also, I would make the point that the last one was not based on data. Like, you can't base everything on data. You know, there are limits to what machine learning and AI can understand. The last principle, when it came to like how you should craft your story, threaten status quo, this is not something we pulled from the million sales calls we analyzed. This was kind of like, here's what we do at Gong. It's working really well for us. We've seen it work for other businesses too. Like, many of our customers approach their sales conversations in a similar way. I don't know if that answers the question. Not 100% sure I understood it. Scott, how did I do?
I think you did well. I think it was just
okay.
around, you know, the best way in your opinion, messaging. And I think we touched on it.
Yeah, the big thing, you know, if it's about messaging, the big thing I'll say is most messaging is benefits-based, and that's not enough to move a buyer. Right. Your messaging needs to introduce loss aversion. So loss aversion is this principle where people are willing to work or risk twice as much to prevent themselves from losing something than they are gain something. And so your message needs to begin with, hey, you've got this great status quo. Guess what? It's now at risk. It's not your fault. It's just the world around you is changing. And if you don't do something about it, things are going to get worse.
Yeah, that's awesome. Okay, so we have a question from Anonymous. Hopefully it's not the hacking organization, but okay, so one of our sales team's issue is lack of internal resources for marketing. So Chris, I'm sure at past orgs, you probably experienced a lack of internal resources. What are your recommendations on organic marketing campaigns that they could run?
I would hire a marketer.
Yeah.
I would not, I know there's like a lot of thought leadership today going around that like sales leaders should like be, you know, supplying content for their sales team. And I think that, not to offend anybody, but I think that argument is absolute hogwash. I don't think sales leaders should be building content stacks for their sales team because it's not their job. That's what product marketing should do. That's what marketing should do. So I have a couple recommendations. First of all, if you're talking about organic marketing campaigns, do not rely on somebody who does not have that specialized skill set to do that. That would be a salesperson or a sales leader. You need to rely on like a professional marketer who has done this before. But if the question is more around how do we win competitive deals and arm our sales team to win competitive deals without a marketing team, you can do everything that we've talked about in this webinar without a marketing team. You know, these narratives that I'm talking about, like these stories where you talk about ripping apart the status quo, that is usually something product marketing is responsible for. But since that is such a sales-centric activity, there's no reason you can't if you're a VP of sales or sales manager, there's no reason you can't lock yourself in a room with your team or with your CEO for a few hours and really try to come up with a narrative that is going to resonate. And if you're kind of lost as far as how to do that, reach out to me on LinkedIn. I don't claim to have all the answers, but I can probably point you in the right direction. You know, you guys can see my name and how it's spelled up on the screen right now. Just search for me on LinkedIn, connect, say, hey, I had a question about how you would recommend approaching these narratives, and I would be happy to answer any questions that I'm qualified to do so.
Awesome. Thank you for that. Okay, so we'll go another question. We have Regina Hilton, and I think I'm articulating this right. I'm going to read it to you, Chris, as it's written, and I'll see if you can kind of grasp it. How would you suggest an organization maintain a pure message when the solution they provide connects to a variety of critical technologies and resolves a variety of problems across a variety of business units.
Yeah, so I call those value categories. Like these are typically the multitude of problems that your product can solve. Mm-hmm. So the first step is identifying your buyer personas. And again, I'm like speaking through the lens of a product marketer, but this is like how it should be done. Step one is identify your different buyer personas. And then step two is identify 2 or 3 value categories for each of those buyer personas and no more. So if you have more, then eliminate the ones that are nice to have and just stick with the 1, 2, worst case scenario 3 for each buyer persona. Now, this is, we're speaking to a primarily sales audience, so I won't like get too in depth on this, but this is mostly a marketing activity as well. For each of those buyer personas and each of those value categories, you're going to want to build messaging and marketing programs and customer advocacy programs to address each one of those. But you can't have so many that it becomes unmanageable. If you do have that many, then I would urge you to eliminate the ones that are nice to haves and just stick with the ones that are must haves. And also, one other point is that you need a lot of resources to be able to execute on all of that. So if you've only got like a small marketing team and you're expecting them to execute on multiple buyer personas and multiple value core categories and build all of these different stories to address all of these different situations, you have a decision to make. You can either scale up your marketing team to be able to address all of that, or if you don't have the money to be able to do that, then just stick with the 1 or 2 most important ones until you get to the point where you can scale that up. Because that is a lot of work for like just a couple people to do. Yeah,
makes sense. So either scale up your marketing or scale down your product or service offering or your focus. Yeah. Makes sense. Great question. Thanks for that question, Regina. And we've got another one from Mike Jaroska. Kind of a statement followed by a question. So I feel that 80% of the sale should be done before the demo even happens. And Mike wants to get your thoughts on that, Chris.
100%.
Yeah.
It's exactly what we just talked about in Principle 5. If you lead with your demo, then you look like a commodity because your competitors are leading with their demo. And now you have put your buyer in a frame of mind where they're comparing the 2 demos, and that leads them to creating a spreadsheet where they start comparing features and grinding down on price. I wouldn't say, as far as specific percentages, I don't really know. But instead of leading with your product, which is what a demo is, you need to lead to your product. You need to tell this story, and it doesn't have to be long. It just has to be a good story. And then it should lead to you showing a demo for the sole reason to just prove to the customer that you can help them take advantage of the opportunity you just spelled out before. But if you lead with your demo, there's no context built out. You might win some deals that way because people have like this predetermined need and they're already going to buy something. But it's really, that's what a good salesperson does. A great salesperson does not lead with a demo. They lead with something that builds context and urgency so that the demo lands well.
I would strongly agree. And seen that play out time and time again when we've, organizations I've been involved with kind of revamp the whole quote unquote demo process to be more, change led as you described. It's shocking the difference that can come quickly. So if you're looking for a quick win out of this webinar, that's one. So Andrew Cambria has a question here. What if a prospect comes to you via a partner, so close relationship, and is looking to onboard your services, ask the right questions, is the right authority, the timing is there, makes a statement indicating that they will move forward? Should you probe and see what other options they're looking at besides you? What's your opinion?
Yeah, I think we're overthinking that. It's just like, hey, are you looking at any alternatives? Are you looking to spend your budget elsewhere that I should be aware of? I think it's worth knowing, because if you don't know, then you might miss your opportunity to win early. Yeah. So like we said, principle, I think it was number 3 is win early. I think it's worth knowing where your competitors stand, because maybe they're evaluating a competitor, but they never said anything on the sales call. And if you don't do anything to address that situation until late in the game, it's too late.
Yeah, totally. And I think you summed it up so well. I think you have to, in that case, shift your thinking that we just learned that competitors are good in a deal. We want competitors, but we want them at the beginning of it. So control it.
You want them to be there, but you want to box them out very quickly. And the way you box them out is let them sell their product. You sell a changing world that your product can help address.
Yeah, love it. All right, we have, let's see. Let's go. Okay, so we got one from Mike Oram. Mike, thanks for the question. So these approaches seem to be product driven. That's Mike's idea. What if you're selling a service for which the organization you're selling to can have multiple options, a panel of chosen partners? How do you continually and effectively sell the differentiators of your organization until given an opportunity to shine?
So it's not going to make a huge difference whether you're selling a product or service, because frankly, none of us are selling a product or service. We're selling an end result. A product is a means to getting there, as is a service. And so approaching that the same way we've talked about, if you're selling a service, is still going to work. You just have to think about when you're telling this story about like a changing status quo, it's got to lead to one of your differentiators, and your differentiators are going to be different than if you're selling a product. A product differentiator, it's a product, it's a feature. Your differentiator might be less tangible than that. It might be excellent customer service. That's not a great example, but you have to think very deeply about like what makes you different. How can you tell a story that eventually leads to your customer valuing that difference rather than starting with that difference and hoping your customer values it? Mm-hmm. So I would say the big takeaway, unless I totally misunderstood the question, is that it's not worlds different if you're selling a product versus a service, because you're not selling those things, you're selling an outcome. You're selling a desired result. Services and products are just different means of achieving those results.
Yeah, I would agree, definitely. Awesome. And okay, I think that wraps us up for questions. So Chris, thank you so much for all your insight. It's always such a pleasure chatting with you. I wish we could, do this all day, but we
got jobs to do, right?
yeah. Those things we actually have to do these things we talk about. We just don't talk about them. But all right, with that note, thank you everyone for tuning in, and thanks again, Chris, and have a awesome week.
Thanks for having me.
See ya.